Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures, Daily Dose of Nature. Today's topic, animals in the wild, why they do what they do. Presented by wildlife biologist Aaron Bott. I'm your host, Rob Mess. Thank you all so much for being here with us today. Over to you, Aaron.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for tuning in. I am excited to be presenting today on what animals do in the wild. I originally titled this presentation Ethology, which is why my title slide today is still titled Ethology, which is the study of animal behavior in an organism's natural environment. And we're going to be talking about basically just that today, about animal behavior. And of course, this is a really complex subject with lots and lots of weeds that we could get into. Fortunately, we've got a lot of webinars coming up in the future, and we'll tackle some of these more interesting, nuanced subjects. So today is really just an overall introduction of what biologists do when it comes to studying and understanding animal behavior, and why it's important, and how it can help you as someone who appreciates animals and wildlife, how it can help you have a better understanding of what's going on in the environment around you. So again, without further ado, we'll just jump into it. So I'm a wildlife biologist, a wolf biologist specifically. I have had the opportunity to work in the American West for a long time now, working with government agencies and non-government agencies, studying and monitoring wildlife populations. I did my graduate research for my master's at Utah State University and studied wolves in Yellowstone, and I worked with the Yellowstone Wolf Project for a number of years. I'm currently working on my doctorate right now, also at Utah State University, and I am also, as I mentioned, employed as a wolf biologist. So I monitor wolf populations and I study their behavior, and I think it's a fascinating subject. I've given a fair number of webinars for Natural Habitat Adventures in the past on a wide variety of species that I have expertise in, or sometimes just subjects or species that I think are fascinating, even if I haven't had the opportunity to work with very many of specific species that I'm interested in. But yeah, I guess as a biologist, I think it's important for wildlife professionals to educate people on how and why we do what we do. And I think that wildlife behavior and the study of it is particularly fascinating. It's a little bit more nuanced than the study of just simply biology. It kind of falls under the umbrella of ecology and biology. In some ways, I think that where ecology, or the study of organisms in an environment and how life interacts with other life and also non-living things, if it were to marry biology, or the study of an organism and how it functions, and the mechanisms of what make an organism what it is, if these two subjects were to marry, they would produce a child that would be called ethology, or the study of an organism's behavior. And so, yeah, without further ado, we're going to kind of dive into this. And again, this is just an introductory presentation today. So we are going to be steering clear of some of the details. We're not going to get into the weeds too much. Hopefully this will just help us have a clearer understanding of exactly what animal behavior is, and what are some of the key questions that we are looking to answer when we study a species. So, as I've said before, ethology is the study of naturally occurring unlearned behavior in wild habitats. Let's break this down just for a minute. There are many ways that we can look at the natural world, but ultimately an organism, in this case, a moose, a bull moose and a cow moose in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, during the rut, or the breeding season, they have a specific worldview, and their behaviors are actions that correspond with stimuli in their environment. And the stimuli can be at a microscopic level or a cellular level. Even lower than that, we can talk about the electrons firing within their bodies that are acting reflexively to different factors within their environment or within their diet that help them to behave in specific ways. Or perhaps when you remove the body from, or when you step back from the body and look at the wider world, you can consider these two animals and how they find themselves in their environment. Specifically, how they deal with survival and finding shelter, and how they mate and how they produce offspring. So this is kind of the behavior I think really fits within the world of not only the population of multiple species in an environment, but also it's very intimate, and behavior affects the individual as well as the population and the greater ecosystem and environment itself, which again I think is why behavior is so fascinating. So I'm going to jump back here to my slide where I've got bison in Yellowstone National Park, and you can see that they're wallowing in deep snow and they're following one another in this line to break through the snow. Perhaps most likely during this time of year, they're trying to migrate to other areas where the habitat is more suitable for their needs. Foraging, or the seeking and consumption of resources for food, is a topic that I've talked about in the past. Foraging behavior is essential for life. It's perhaps the most essential action or behavior of any animal or organism. And how exactly are these bison struggling to meet their caloric needs? What do they do when it snows? How do they handle going hungry? How long can they go hungry for? What do they do to find food? All of these questions relate very closely with the study of this animal in their natural world. Again, I'd like to highlight another word here in my definition: unlearned behavior, the study of unlearned behavior. So what I mean by saying unlearned behavior is we know of animals that can be educated to learn new skills, or they can develop new tools in order to adapt to their environment. And this is a fascinating part of the study of animal behavior, but in some cases it's not natural animal behavior. For example, we have parrots that learn to mimic the human voice, for example. And to some degree, and this is a little bit more of a gray area, so just go with me for a minute, but the domestication of our pets. So we've got cats and dogs, for example, that live often within our homes, and they've been taught to do tricks. How would a dog in a human-dominated environment adapt and behave to that environment differently than it would to a more feral environment or a wilder environment? Now, those are the kind of questions that we're looking at. There's a lot of laboratory studies of wildlife behavior. I'm going to skip over here to this slide just for a second. And those are kind of the physiological studies of how animals and organisms behave and why they behave the way that they do. And this kind of study is very important. I don't want to undermine it at all, but it does work better and is improved when put in tandem with the study of the whole animal, or the behavior of an animal in its environment and how it interacts with environment. So the science of animal behavior that looks at the physiological and even the psychological development of a behavior basically is looking almost through a microscope, and in some cases actually through a microscope, to understand the inner workings of how the body works. This is deep biology. It's trying to understand the chemicals and the electrons that fire, and the nerves and the muscles and the sense the sense organs, which are all coordinated together to produce a very complex behavior. For example, when it's time for a grizzly bear to reproduce, there are chemicals that are fired in the body. There are hormones that are triggered, which then stimulate other physiological responses that drive the animal towards the act of copulation and ultimately gestation and then rearing of offspring. So there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes that we sometimes have to get really close in order to study and fully appreciate. And we can do a lot of this kind of research in a laboratory, for example, again, trying to study the complexities of these chemicals and these molecules and cells and these electrons that are firing within the body and what exactly is taking place, again, behind the scenes or under the skin, if you will. But that only can inform us so much so far. And the study of ethology is to put that animal in the context of its environment. Ultimately, we're looking at the whole animal. We're looking at the animal in the environment in which it was adapted, which greatly can influence the inner mechanisms of the animal's body as well. So it's kind of a circle, actually. For example, when you have herbivores that are grazing, or you have a carnivore that is eating meat, the diet and the nutrients that the animal is ingesting ultimately is something that drives the chemical responses within the body. And again, then the body, if it is receiving the right nutrients, if the hormones are healthy and activating appropriately, that's going to trigger other reflexes and other behavioral responses. These behaviors, again, responding to the stimuli of having a balanced diet for whatever species we're looking at or whatever species we're studying. So again, it's kind of like the chicken or the egg sort of a question, and it's important to realize that the study of animal behavior has to involve multiple facets, different factors that help us to truly understand an animal's behavior. And we can't just look at an animal through a microscope. We have to put it out in the environment in order to truly appreciate it, but vice versa as well. So again, I like this slide because I hope to emphasize that we are looking at individuals and ultimately populations, and we're trying to see things through their world, how they defend themselves, how they survive, how they protect themselves. And all of this is going back to the biological and evolutionary responses of how animals behave the way they do and why they behave the way they do. So if you're still with me, as biologists and ethologists, we kind of have this really great kind of function that was put together in the 1950s by Nicholas Tinbergen, who was a famous biologist and ornithologist who won the Nobel Prize for his work on animal behavior. And Tinbergen developed 4 questions, which are now really very fundamental for the understanding of all wildlife research when it comes to appreciating why animals do what they do. And these 4 questions I've listed here, and we'll go through them quickly, but they aren't necessarily independent. In fact, very often they are dependent upon one another. So when a biologist or a researcher hopes to have a better understanding of a particular behavior, we have to look at how exactly this behavior fits within these 4 questions. Understanding again and appreciating that these questions are not independent, but often, and in this case, are also not chronological. Very often when you start to ask one question, you can't help but inevitably ask another question to follow up on, and again, having a better understanding of how the organism responds. So Tinbergen's 4 questions are function, evolution, causation and development. So why an animal behaves the way that it does. Function is ultimately describing how or why an animal behaves the way it does and how this behavior helps the animal's survival. So the functionality of having this behavior. The animal has to have that kind of behavior for some purpose, and that purpose has got to support the animal's overall survival, its reproduction, or its development. You don't behave without purpose, more or less. So why does an animal behave the way it does, and how does that behavior help its overall function? And then another question is the evolution of a behavior. Behaviors very rarely, if ever, are spontaneous, and very rarely, if ever, do they just pop out of nowhere. Behaviors, again, are something that help drive an individual's survival. And these characteristics, these traits, whether they are ultimately learned by their environment or social learning, or they're genetically retained in memory, how do these behaviors come to be, and how were they once engaged by the predecessors of the animal or the species in question? So how has the behavior evolved over time? Then we can get into the causation, and the causation is more about the mechanisms, again, looking under the skin of the animal. What is it that triggers such a behavior? What kind of chemicals, hormones, what kind of muscles, what kind of nerves or senses are behind the scene, which ultimately are working to stimulate or execute such behavior? And then finally, the last question is the development of a behavior. So there is no fixed point or end point in any organism's development on life. We call it ontogeny. So as a man myself, I have changed quite a lot in my 34 years of living on this planet. My body has developed and changed since when I was an infant, and then a toddler, and then a boy, and then a teenager, then a young man, and now someone in my prime. And my life development will still continue to change. And as my body changes, my behaviors change as well. So the development within an individual is another question that we come to ask when we look at Tinbergen's 4 questions. So to break this down a little bit further and to help us have a better understanding of these 4 questions, I've kind of taken a case example of elk, a species that I often interact with, since as a large carnivore biologist, I study wolves, and wolves eat elk. I've given a presentation for NetHab before on elk and their natural history. But I think that this example will help people understand, again, how biologists go about understanding and appreciating wildlife behavior. So we're going to go with function to begin with. So function, how a behavior helps with the survival and reproduction of any individual. Well, here on my slide, I've got a very impressive bull elk. And to answer or to investigate this question, bull elk generally live in bachelor herds. They're separate from maternal herds or female groups. And they live generally on their own or in these smaller bachelor herds where they graze and they occasionally browse on vegetation in order for them to not only become large in stature, but also to develop these impressive crowns, these large antlers that grow from the top of their heads. Antlers are a bone that grows outside of the body rather than inside the body. And not only are they impressive to look at, but their life cycle is very impressive as well. Antlers grow every year and then are shed, and then they grow these antlers again from scratch. So what is the purpose of having these antlers, and what is the function of having these antlers? Well, we know that antlers are a secondary sexual characteristic. They, being large and symmetrical, can attract a mate. They are what we call honest indicators of an individual's fitness. So the idea behind this theory is that if an elk has a balanced diet, then and if he has healthy genes, then he's going to produce very impressive antlers. And cow elk are going to see this and they're going to be impressed by his antlers and they're going to be more inclined to mate with him and to breed with him. And this is in turn going to pass along the survival, or excuse me, the genes of this animal and ensure the survival of this animal's genes in the population. So how does this animal's behavior, which could be in our question, foraging in order to get enough nutrients to develop large antlers, or how is its behavior with, let's say, sexual selection, trying to attract a mate of the opposite sex, or intra, intraspecific and intrasexual competition? How does this individual compete with animals of the same species and the same sex, all help to benefit its own survival? And why does it behave the way it behaves in response to these environmental questions? So again, we just came up with a list of questions that we can all apply to the basic function of this bull elk and why it is the way that it is and how that ultimately helps with its survival and reproduction. Moving on to the second of Tinbergen's questions, we can look at evolution. So elk are a member of the deer family, the Cervidae, and of course they're mammals, and mammals have been around for the last, let's see, 85 million years. And as they've developed and changed over time, how did we get from very rudimentary shrew-like primitive mammals during the end of the age of the dinosaurs to these very impressive Rocky Mountain bull elk that we see today when we go out into Yellowstone or other parts of the American West? And why do we have antlers the way that we see them today? How did they develop and how did they benefit ancestors of our bull elk today? This skeleton right here is not a direct, it's not from an animal that is directly related as an ancestor to the elk, although it is commonly known as the Irish elk or the stag elk, a now extinct species with the largest headgear on the planet ever, the biggest antlers, ranging up to 11 feet from tip to tip. How has the antlers that we're familiar with right here, how have they changed and evolved over time? And we can look at cousins of the modern elk, such as this Irish elk, now extinct again, to more direct ancestors to our Rocky Mountain elk. Why did antlers change over time? How did these animals behave differently in the past? How did an animal like this walk around effectively and practice surviving and reproducing with antlers so dramatic? And is this perhaps what we call an example of runaway selection theory, where evolution found a niche which exploited sexual selection in favor of male deer, male cervids, but ultimately the evolutionary train ran away with itself and we had animals producing more bizarre and cumbersome headgear, which ultimately led to the diminished survival rates of a species, ultimately ending in stagnation. Again, all of these questions are coming from the point of view of evolution and animal behavior. How have things changed in the past? How did we get to where we are today? Then moving on to causation, how the body is coordinated to produce such behaviors. So perhaps I'm interested in knowing, for example, how elk have a Flehmen response, which is this really cool olfactory kind of capability of male elk, in this case, being able to sense the estrous cycle of a female who's going into heat through basically inhaling through its mouth and through its nose and being able to sense the chemical signals of a female nearby, which is ready and capable of reproduction. So I can get into the weeds of studying exactly what it is to be an elk and what it's like to smell like an elk and um, what kind of glands or olfactory glands or what kind of internal behavior and firing mechanisms and hormones are all being triggered during, for example, the rut or the breeding season. So unlike humans, most animals have what's known as an estrous cycle, or they typically have seasonal breeding periods, whereas humans have a menstrual cycle and we have a continuous breeding life cycle where we're capable of breeding anytime that a male or female is in their reproductive prime. These animals have basically on and off signals that determine when it's okay to breed and when it's not okay to breed and produce offspring. Again, mostly triggered by hormones, which again is largely triggered by diet, but not just the diet, but also the photoperiod or the sunlight that this animal again evolved into. So tying causation back into evolution and in beginning to investigate just how animals work and how they've come to work the way that they do today. And then of course development, how nature and nurture ultimately shape growing animals. So this really brand spanking new elk calf just popped out of its mother in Mammoth, Yellowstone in June, most likely is when this picture was taken. And here this baby animal is taking its first steps and getting its first meal of mother's milk. Well, how ultimately is the genes from our bull elk, going back here, how is his genes going to influence the development of this elk calf? And not only that, but how are the genes of the mother going to influence its development? In addition to that, how is nurture, or how well this mother is taking care of this elk, ultimately going to shape this animal and how it develops? And as it becomes more independent, how is it going to make its own decisions? How, when it becomes sexually mature, when it becomes capable of leading a maternal herd or perhaps defending itself against wolves? What is the development of this individual as it grows up and changes throughout the course of its life history? Where does learning come into play? And this is something that we'll talk about in just a minute with social animals and even cultures within animal groups. What exactly is this particular individual capable of as it develops and as it interacts with its environment around it? This popular question of nature versus nurture really took off in the 20th century, and now most everyone in the field of psychology and wildlife behavior realize that there is not really a question there, because they actually work in tandem, where not only do your genes influence how you ultimately develop, but also your environment comes into play as well. So again, going through this, these 4 questions can help us have a better understanding of exactly why animals are the way they are in their wild environment. I think that they can help us to appreciate the natural world around us, and it doesn't matter what kind of species you're interested in or what species your pet project might be into investigating. This kind of research really helps us to understand everything from the humorous activity of bears pre-breeding season in the summer as they walk around and they advertise themselves by rubbing their sebaceous glands and their scent all over trees. They're basically advertising, and they're also getting ready for competing. Sometimes physical competition directly, as boar Grizzly bears fight for breeding opportunities with receptive females, and sometimes indirectly, again, as they're reserving themselves and protecting themselves from injury by simply stating with a back scratch on a tree uh, how old they are, how big they are, how capable they are of defending a home range and potential mates within that home range. All of this type of functionality ultimately lends to the individual's survival and reproductive success. And we also look at the adaptations that take place within an individual as their behavior flexes depending on its environment and depending on its evolutionary history. This is a coyote or a coyote. I've given a few presentations for NatHab on coyotes. But coyotes are notorious for having extreme adaptability as a generalist species, which is why we're seeing them in places where they have not historically been. They're expanding their range rapidly during this period in the Earth's history where humans are dominating all corners of the globe. That doesn't seem to be suppressing or even getting in the way of coyotes as they continue to expand their range. One of the reasons for this is they have evolved as what we call a mesopredator, a medium-sized carnivore that is highly adaptive. It's a generalist. It doesn't depend specifically on one kind of diet. It can adapt to just about anything. And having grown up in the shadow of larger carnivores that often suppress or oppress this species, they are taking advantage of the environment which is being exploited by people as people remove large carnivores, which historically have oppressed, again, coyotes. Now coyotes have more opportunities to expand and to reproduce and to take over habitats which were historically unavailable to them. So this kind of behavior, which we call fission fusion, where coyotes, even though they're also persecuted relentlessly by people, they have evolved to be able to live independently or in social groups, which ultimately, again, influence the survival of the species. And this kind of evolutionary history is a perfect example of how animal behavior can be projected into the future based off of an individual's capabilities. And then, of course, we have the mechanisms of causation. And this great picture taken by Doug Smith in Yellowstone National Park of wolves chasing after an elk. We have this evolutionary arms race. A study by Matt Metz and Dan McNulty, which came out just a couple years ago, showed that elk that shed their antlers earlier in the spring than other elk generally are targeted by wolves, because not only do the antlers act as a secondary sexual characteristic used for breeding, but also they can be used as a weapon, of course, against predators. And this is an incredible study, which again shows the causation and the mechanisms of why perhaps elk hold on to their antlers. They retain their antlers on top of their head a lot longer than their sympatric species that live with them on the landscape, such as moose and mule deer. Moose will shed their antlers generally around Christmas time, and deer shed their antlers generally around January and February, but elk retain their antlers all the way through March and sometimes until the 1st of April. Why do they hold on to their antlers so long when it takes so long for them to grow? Well, elk in many places where they coexist with wolves are the primary prey for wolves. And again, perhaps the causation at play here, the retention of keeping antlers glued to your head longer, is ultimately going to influence your own survival. And the mechanisms behind that, I think, are truly interesting. And then, of course, how exactly do animals change as individuals? There is no change, or there is no end to change within an individual's life cycle. You don't reach a point where you stop developing. And that goes not only for the same species, but obviously when we look at the development of binary sex. So males of the same species will develop and change differently than females of the same species because they have different life histories. They reach sexual maturity at different ages. Their capability of reproducing is very different. Bison reach sexual maturity around the age of 2, between 2 and 3. But most male bison don't have the opportunity to successfully breed until they're as old as 6 or 7, and even then it's for a very short period of time, whereas females can start to breed with males much earlier because they live in polygamous communities during the breeding season, and the males usually dominate a specific area and take over a harem. So again, just the life cycle of individual animals and how things change. And since we're talking about reproduction, how animals go through sexual senescence when their bodies are no longer capable of reproduction. What happens then? What happens when their bodies wear down and deteriorate, when their teeth fall out? And how does that influence their behavior? Do they gravitate to new food sources, or are they ostracized from the herd or from the social group that they're living in? All of these things come into play and are fascinating to investigate and look into. And I'll kind of wrap up here by talking about how behavioral research can help us have a better understanding for management practices as well. Since I work mostly with wolves, I've had the opportunity to work on developing novel, non-lethal tools to protect livestock from predators in order to better coexist with carnivores. Instead of completely eradicating them, how can we influence or exploit animal behavior for mutual benefit? Wolves, for example, are carnivores, and they're carnivores that have a specific hunting behavior where they target vulnerable animals. And in some cases, livestock are the most vulnerable animals in the environment. And when that happens, wolves can target sheep and cattle, much to the chagrin of people. And it's important to realize that for the wolf is pursuing prey. It doesn't know that it's pursuing property. And humans have this kind of categorical definition of predation versus depredation. Depredation being property damage. It's a no-no when it happens, right? But the carnivores themselves don't recognize a difference between the sheep and the elk on the landscape. To them, it's just a food resource, and it's the same food resource that they've seen all their lives, and most likely for multiple generations, because we've had sheep and cattle on the landscape for so long that there's no necessarily genetic memory for prey preference, one species over another species, domestic versus wild. So how can we exploit, in this case, wolf behavior? Well, we develop tools that help us. Wolves are what we call neophobic. They're generally shy of things that they're unfamiliar with, and they don't like stimuli or stimulants that interrupt their predatory practices. And so we have what we call like these flash tags, which we've been working on developing, and we stick them on the back of livestock's ears, and they flash at night. Here's me working with some wolves and working with livestock as well to take advantage of, again, this neophobic response that wolves have. These flashing ear tags, they blink in the nighttime and they're motion sensitive. And so when a wolf pursues livestock, suddenly this flash tag starts blinking and the wolf sees it and freaks out. It doesn't know what to do because it doesn't anticipate that kind of response to its own predatory response. Also in the upper right hand corner, we have what's called fladry, which is basically a bunch of wire that we hang around a pasture with these long ribbons that dangle in the wind. And most people have a hard time believing this, but this tool, fladry, has been around for thousands of years, and it's used to keep wolves out of pastures where you have sheep and you have cattle. Because as those flags, as those ribbons dangle in the wind, it frightens the wolves. And in some cases, if the fladry is made the right size, it will frighten coyotes as well. And so it's a great tool for protecting your livestock. But also we have to take into consideration that wolves are very adaptive learners, which is one of the problems that we have. And ultimately, if we leave the fladry up, for example, they become habituated to it, kind of like a scarecrow or one of those plastic owls that you stick on the corner of your house to keep woodpeckers away. If you leave it in the same spot for too long, then the animals, the woodpeckers, the jays, whatever you have, they figure it out and they realize it's not real, it's just a dummy, and they're no longer afraid of it. If you leave the fladry up for too long, the wolves ultimately figure out that it's just ribbons dangling from a wire. And so it's kind of, again, going back to an arms race. It's trying to figure out how to disrupt predatory behavior of wolves and take advantage of their neophobia, but also understanding that ultimately these animals are capable learners and they adapt to their environment, and we want to avoid habituation whenever possible. And so we're constantly trying to figure out more tools to try and protect them and protect livestock, because we don't want wolves to get in trouble when they're out on the landscape. We don't want them to eat livestock. I'll just conclude with this slide that I think behavior is beautifully matched to any way of life. Again, humans, animals, all organisms that have some kind of behavioral reflex or function, we behave certain ways because it's advantageous to us. And we've all, if you have a pet, or if you've just seen videos on the internet of pets or animals, we've all seen when individual animals or pets get into awkward circumstances and situations, and it's goofy. And we as animals are well aware when we are on ground that is unfamiliar to us, and we feel awkward and self-conscious, and we don't perform or execute or behave in a particularly flattering way. But those kind of events are rare. They're rare for ourselves as individuals, and more often than not, they're rare for all animals in the animal kingdom. Animals have evolved and adapted to specific behaviors that have developed because of their functionality to the environment in which the animal lives. And when you see an interaction of a coyote right here as he's staring down a grizzly bear, and the grizzly bear has come forth out of its den early in the spring and is on top of a winter-killed elk or deer that died because of starvation or some other cause. You see this really beautiful and delicate behavior on all aspects of life, where the bear knows exactly what he's doing and he's defending his meal. The coyote knows exactly what he's doing, how he's trying to get closer to steal a bite, but he also understands that the bear is dangerous and he wants to avoid confrontation wherever possible. Both of these animals are tenacious and again, beautiful in their own ways because of their behavior, because of everything from the causation, the mechanisms happening underneath the skin, which stimulate these kind of reflexes and responses, to the kind of behavior that is taking place under the skull, where the brain is firing and they're trying to problem solve as they dance around one another. to the kind of environment that they're in, knowing that there might be food that the bear has found, but perhaps there's also food elsewhere. So I think, again, all of this is a beautiful play within the animal kingdom. And as I mentioned before, this is just an introduction to ethology, or the study of wild animal behavior in a natural environment. We could talk about so much more, but I again appreciate you tuning in for today, and thanks for your time.
All right, thank you, Aaron. Now, before we start with the question and answer session, I would like to remind everyone that you can submit your questions via the question field in your control panel. So, could you let us know, when did this particular way of studying unlearned behavior start and what triggered it?
Yeah, the study of animal behavior is pretty new when you consider, the study of everything else that humans participate in. Animal behavioral studies really took place in the 19th century, is kind of when they started to get off the ground. You've got Pavlov's dog, and the salivation at the bell. Darwin talks about how evolution is influenced and natural selection is influenced by animal behaviors. But really, it wasn't until the late 20th century that we began to have the ability to study animals in the wild as successfully as we're doing today. For example, GPS collars that we put on animals to better understand how they move and interact with the land, those kind of tools didn't really take off until after the 1970s. So honestly, it's a science that has really blossomed in the last 40 or 50 years at most.
Great, thank you for that. How is it that you study the role of hormones, genes, and chemistry in animal behavior? Is that primary through observation?
Yeah, it's often through observation, and I'm not a geneticist. I don't get into the nitty gritty, but I often depend on people who are smarter in that field than I am to be able to answer questions for us. So, for example, cortisol is a stress hormone that we can test for either in feces or more often from the hair of specific animals. So, just because it's coming to mind, if we want to know how stressed livestock are when wolves are on the landscape, we can test for cortisol by taking hair samples and sending it to a lab. Cortisol is, this chemical fired by hormones, which help us to better interpret how that animal is engaging with its environment. So that kind of stuff is done by people wearing lab coats, people who are a lot smarter than I am.
Well, thank you, sir. Is structural adaptation considered separate from physiological adaptation?
Let me think about that. Yeah, so I'll do my best to answer. I'm not sure I understand the question 100%, but yeah, so physiological adaptation is the body's physical responses and how it adapts to an environment. The structural is more based off of the limitations of, say, like the genetic pool. For example, in evolution, you're not going to expect your dog anytime in the next 10 million years to sprout wings, because there's been so much genetic divergence there that while if you go way, 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 way back, wolves and birds are somewhat related. Again, the genetic pools have diverged to the point where you can't make something that is not currently in the genetic pool. There's no kind of mutation that would take place there. Whereas a physical or physiological adaptation is a response more to the environment off of the genes that do exist. So I don't know if I answered that question the way that it was meant to be asked, but if I understood it correctly, that's my answer.
Thank you for addressing it. Do appreciate that. Um, so, do wolves get used to the flags or the flashing ear tags? And is it practical to collar most wolves to help track them and to help prevent them from attacking livestock?
Well, good questions. So wolves do become habituated to things like flattery. They can be habituated to flashing lights that we hang on fences, often called fox lights. The ear tag study is still so new that we hope that they won't become used to the flashing lights because, again, the flashing lights are motion sensitive. So it only takes place when livestock are being chased. But we don't have answers to that. But of course, I always point out that in biology, the beautiful thing is we only have rules of thumbs, right? All the information I present is only statistically accurate because every creature, just like every person, is an individual, and you'll always find some oddball that breaks the rules, that defeats the statistics. They're the odd man out, if you will. Collaring wolves is extremely complicated, and there's this massive expectation that by collaring wolves, we can prevent livestock depredation, which is inaccurate for a number of reasons. One, because it's impossible to collar all wolves. It's hard enough to collar one or two wolves in a pack. And because wolves live in packs, just because you know where one wolf is doesn't mean that you know where all of the other wolves are, because packs live together, but they're not always cohesive. They don't always travel together. So you might know where your collared wolf is, and he might not be getting into trouble, but maybe his sister is getting into trouble somewhere else. So that's just one of the ways that it can express the complexity of collaring. There's a lot of social pressure because people like the idea of knowing where wolves are and being alert when you have wolves in the neighborhood. But it's extremely expensive. It's not very realistic in terms of how much help it has to offer. And yet we are still often demanded by the public and the legislature to put out as many collars as possible for the sake of trying to inform the public.
Does a bear that kills a human, does that bear suddenly become more prone to killing humans? Is that why they are euthanized?
Very good question. And yes, that is the thought process. That's a great question. And I've got a long answer for it, so I'm going to try and make it quick. But we know that bears are capable of social learning, and bears are also dangerous. Fortunately, most of the time, we coexist with bears phenomenally well. Negative interactions occur very rarely, especially ones that lead in human mortality. But yes, bears are strong and they're dangerous, and there's only so much social tolerance that is available for an animal that preys upon people. And it is very possible that human predation, where a bear kills a human and consumes a human for the purpose of consumption, not a defensive response, but a predatory response, there is very likely the possibility that that bear can become habituated to attacking people. So that's why they're often euthanized. That's why they're always euthanized, I should say.
Thank you for addressing that question. So back to the collared wolves for a second. Are they monitored all the time? Is there a continuous source of information on them, or is it just occasional?
Just occasional. Yep. So there's two kinds of collars that we put out. GPS collars. GPS collars are programmed to send a GPS point several times in a 24-hour period, but it's not continuous. It's not like your phone. The reason why is because the batteries of these collars don't last that long. At most, they last 2 years. GPS collars are also expensive. You're talking like $3,000 to $4,000 per collar. VHF collars are radio collars. They are always transmitting, but they're not GPS. So that means you have to fly around in an airplane with an antenna looking for where your wolf is at. And so you don't have the ability to upload the wolf's location from your phone or from your computer. You actually have to be in the field to locate that individual. Those collars have a much longer battery life, like 7 years, and they're cheap, like $300 or $400 a pop. So we put out as many GPS collars as possible, but obviously even then it's not continuously sharing information with us. And so I can pull up my computer data right now and say like, oh, I have, a dozen wolves in this location, but they were there 6 hours ago. I don't know where they are right now.
Have electric fences been used to help deter wolves?
Yep, and they work really well. Electric fences work great with bears. In fact, they're the only thing that really work consistently with bears. Fladry, that fence that I showed you with the dangling ribbons, an upgraded version of that is called turbo fladry, and it is electrified. It helps to lengthen the time before habituation takes place, but even habituation to electric fences can happen. So if you have a permanent fence that is put in the ground and is electrified, then that is your best case of defense. And we often recommend that people with small pastures, small operations of livestock, do something like that. The problem is in the West and in other places, but mostly the West, we have open range. You can't fence in tens of thousands of acres. It's too expensive. A lot of that land is public land, so it's not even possible. And of course, then you'd be fencing out all the other wild animals that need the same pasture as your livestock as well. So it's not an option in all cases.
Well, Aaron, that's going to be the last question that we do have for today. So I'd like to hand it back to you for your closing comments.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. Again, I think that the study of animal behavior is truly fascinating, and hopefully this was just a decent introductory presentation, and hopefully it will help you have a better understanding of your interests. Next time you go out in the field and you see an animal, you can ask yourself, I wonder why it does that. I wonder how that helps that animal survive, or I wonder how that behavior evolved in that species, or I wonder how that behavior is going to change over time as that animal gets older. So yeah, ask yourselves those questions, and thanks again for tuning in today.
Aaron, thank you so much for taking the time to present for us today. And I'd also like to thank everyone who tuned in today. If you're interested in information on how you can travel with NatHab, give us a call at the number on your screen, or you can send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. Join us Monday for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out next week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next time.